Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I welcome you very much to Radio Evolve, our weekly broadcast for consciousness and culture. I'm happy to have with us Gail Bradbrook, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, ecological activist, scientist from her background. Gail, thank you for being with us.
I'm glad to be here, Thomas. Thank you.
Gail, I mean, we are in the midst of a lot of crises right now. There's the virus crisis, there is an economic crisis, there is even on the background right now only the crisis of the planet, the ecological crisis. The Extinction Rebellion, just by its name, brings it to the point that we are talking about our extinction as a possible near future possibility. I would like to talk to you as being one of the founders of the Extinction Rebellion, that also has people in Germany and all around the globe working on and bringing to our attention that the global climate change is something that is much more urgent, much more direct than we still want to think. At the same time, I hear that you are also seeing this as a crisis of consciousness of our culture and consciousness of our civilization. And I would like to start with the question, where do you see the connection between the different crises that we're in right now, the virus crisis, the climate crisis, the economic crisis, the social crisis, and what maybe we can call a crisis of consciousness?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I see it in layers. We have a systemic layer, we have a political economy, generally called neoliberalism, very captured to corruption. The economic mechanisms that focus on growth don't make sense, to have infinite growth on a finite planet and so on. I know more obviously about the UK case, the media being very captured to promoting a certain narrative. I mean, obviously there's some plurality in there, but the mainstream has not been telling the truth on the crises. The capture of our politicians to short-termism and so on. So there's systemic issues. And then underneath that layer is a sort of cultural layer, the culture of consumerism, and it's fueled by a layer underneath, which I would call patriarchy, but you could use a different words. I mean, and from patriarchy emerges, white supremacy and some of the other really rabid social issues we're facing, the move back in the direction of fascism. And with patriarchy, I mean, my understanding is that it's somehow a wound that some aspects of humanity suffered from, struggled with. Maybe there was a traumatic event, and it has spurred I say some of us because we think it's all of us, but indigenous cultures aren't in this wound. I mean, they're affected by it. And by that, I mean the idea that the earth is scarce, that there's not enough to go around, that we're separated from each other and from our purpose and from nature, and that we're powerless to do anything. And from that kind of patriarchal wound, this desire to dominate, to extract, to take, in a way that can never be satisfied. It's called the Rakshasas, I think, in Hinduism. It's the hungry ghost of Buddhism. In the Algonquin languages of indigenous culture, it's Wetiko. There's this hunger that can't be satisfied. And, the layer underneath all of that, I guess, is our connection to divinity, to the oneness, to the flow of life and purpose. And I think when you have that connection, you can recognize patriarchal wounds for what they are, for trauma that need healing, and how they're showing up in our culture, and then how they're showing up in our systemically. That's how I see it.
And obviously, Extinction Rebellion wants to bring this to a public consciousness and a public awareness. And obviously, you're also making the point that we don't have time, even that the time has run out. So what you're addressing are very deep structures in society, in culture, but also in all of us. It's something that's not just out there, it's also in us. And how can we address this in a way that we can respond to Earth, that we can respond to the life forces? Is there a way, is there a strategy, is there an answer that allows us to respond to the urgency and to the depth of the crisis at the same time?
I mean, again, to use those layers, I always say to people, the first thing to do is to really feel this thing, to really feel it. And it's hard to look at. It's like facing an abyss. To look and know that the time's now arrived. It's not, we're not talking about the future. People struggling right now. We have our own children who are questioning what future they have. I mean, they're already in a situation where they're being told not to have parties and not to do, get off with each other. That's a British phrase for, sex and so on. To not go and hang out and have fun at university. I mean, their lives are already being impacted because of it. I hope it's obvious, but the COVID crisis is part of this crisis, right? It's a zoonotic disease. They emerge more rapidly under climate conditions, under climate chaos, and they're to do with biodiversity loss. So, we're already in this thing. And so the first thing to do is to feel that, to feel what have we done? To look at it, what have we done? And because I think if you try and tackle this purely intellectually, you can't find the resilience or the moral force or the compunction to do what's needed. So it needs to tap into the emotion and the longing for life on Earth. I mean, I think that's how I experience it on a spiritual or sacred level, is that life's longing for itself. And in that way, through that grieving process, and it is a process and it does come in waves, and I always say to people, don't do it on your own, find other people to talk to who get it, and you don't feel like, insane with these feelings or alone. As you feel this thing, I think it is also an opportunity, because something can birth, which is that our lives are bigger than us. We have these short times to be on Earth. We have a time to be a good ancestor to what's coming. And the consumer culture robs us of life. It takes us away from life. And so the climate crisis and ecological crisis, as much as it's the biggest horror you can sort of imagine, it's also a gift to see the beauty in life and to appreciate it. In the same way that if your friend was dying, you wouldn't walk away from them and go, well, they're going to die, there's no point bothering anymore. You'd be like so seeing and technical of their beauty and wanting that connection. And I'm not trying to say that Earth is dying, because much of life is dying on Earth, that's for sure. We're in the 6th mass extinction event. There are consequences for what we've done. I think there's a requirement for some humility here, that we don't really know what's unfolding. What the bigger plan here is. But yeah, did I answer your question? I can't remember.
No, you are. You're talking about that the first response is to feel it. And it reminds me to something that, in fact, in a radio interview like this, Joe Brewer, who you probably know, a system theorist from America, said to really be able to respond to our climate collapse is to remorse about what is really going on. And that very much resonated with me. And I understand that we have to be touched and be able to feel that. But at the same time, you also talked about consumer culture and talked about something that is bigger than us. Because if I just feel, I also can be very just personally panicking about the situation. And I guess that's not what you're calling for. So there's something where I personally have to be aware in a feeling sense what's going on, but I also have to have an understanding that there are different layers, as you were explaining, of what is happening to us. How do you think that these different layers go together?
Yeah, I mean, it's Greta Thunberg did say, I don't want you to feel hopeful, I want you to panic, or something like that. So, I mean, I would say when, you know, I think that's quite right, it is a remorse and a grieving. And part of grieving is bargaining, you know, where you're like, oh, well, maybe this, maybe that. So I think it's always worth checking whether we're trying to pull ourselves away from the emotion of this too quickly sometimes, you know, because it's hard to face. And I think that when big things happen in people's lives, whether it's the loss of a loved one or the breakdown of a key relationship or, you know, losing your job or, you know, losing your health and so on, they create these moments of crisis, and we want to be told they're not quite true, or there's, do you know what I mean? We want an escape route. So I think that's part of a thing to observe, you know, witness conscience and all that. In each of us, what are we doing? What deals are we making with ourselves to make it be a bit okay? And then what's our contribution? And I think, again, the sort of patriarchal wound would have us from our guilt, from our shame, let's say, more from the shame, panic in a way that's, oh, I'll do this, I'll throw myself at this wall, or I'll, you know, change my lifestyle dramatically or whatever, in a way that can be coming from not a very healthy place. So I think it's worth checking in. And I don't think it's for me to say to anybody what your particular path is. Obviously, I'd love people to come and join Extinction Rebellion and get involved in that side of things. But there are many other things that people can do, including within a rebellion, by the way. There's lots of different roles and jobs to be done. And I think rather than, you know, I sat in prayer in the winter solstice last year, wondering what was needed, and it felt like it was such a strong message to really love life and to really celebrate life. And in that way, I feel that we're meant to bring our gifts forwards at this time. You know, it's not like guilt is something that shows us something's not right and something needs addressing in our lives, sure. And what are we being called to do? Because I think we're being called to really step up in a way that's largely joyful and purposeful. I mean, it is so tedious, this consumer culture where, you know, we lost our wonderful anthropologist David Graeber this September, and he'd written this brilliant book called Bullshit Jobs. So much of the work that we're asked to do or forced to do or submit to doing is bullshit, right? We're being asked to do the work of repairing the harm now and stopping the harm, and it's sacred work, isn't it? So what's yours to do in these times? Find a way to make it happen.
It's interesting listening to you because, if I may say so, there's so much love for life, and in some way also, I would say, optimism, what I hear. And one of the main accusations that I hear against Extinction Rebellion is that Extinction Rebellion is something like a death cult. And that also the aesthetics that you're having and the message that you're bringing, basically, we're all doomed. There is a contradiction between the way I hear you talking and the way how Extinction Rebellion is portrayed, at least in some media. Where do you think this discrepancy comes from?
I mean, I loved it so much when we really got the artists joining the rebellion, because that's what brings the message to life. And there are different things that need to be said in different ways at different times, and we sometimes have skulls and so on. And I have to say, to some extent, I experienced some of the kind of more we're fucked type of messaging is quite, I don't mean tongue in cheek as in we don't agree. We do think we're fucked. We do think we're in a mess, right? But it's also there's something kind of how to say it, there's a lightness in just naming it. You know, it's not. Let's just say it. We're I mean, that's how we say it, and it's a slightly youthful thing in the UK. We're fucked. You know, like it doesn't feel that we're then supposed to crawl in a pit and just not emerge. You know, we're not asking people to lay down and die. So that's why I don't think we're a death cult. We're asking people to live, and actually, I've had so much fun in Extinction Rebellion. I mean, the Samba bands, for example, those that are part of the Samba band are just amazing, and lift such a tribal energy and joy and purpose, group energy. It's not. I mean, you know, endless Zoom meetings and work to be done, and some of it's boring and hard work. Like any purposeful thing that we need to do has its moments of they're a bit joyless, but we're not here to bring misery. We're here to bring truth. You know, like the science is, it's you can't argue with science, really. It's what it is. Yeah.
It's interesting because, of course, the message of Extinction Rebellion, I mean, it's in the name. It's pretty clear what the name is about, and the name is backed up with science. That it's not 5 minutes to 12, it's much more than that. And there are enough analysis where basically it says we are doomed. There is no realistic way out. We will have to go to a major crisis to make a turnaround. So I take this as being for granted that this is just how it is. But at the same time, you seem to have spirit, let's call it that way. Where do you take the spirit from? What gives you spirit in all of this? I mean, if I may use the British word, if we are fucked, where's the place for spirit in this?
Well, you know, so in some ways, when there's nothing left to grasp onto, then the invitation is to live. There's something in consumer culture that's death phobic, that doesn't want us to focus on the reality of our short lives, you know, and so you face not only your own mortality, the huge risks that we're in, and as I say, it's like what life are you being called into? And you know, I mean, the thing is here that there is so much possibility. I mean, it's not that we couldn't sort this thing out. We'll still have major problems, but if we had what you might think of as like a post-war effort, or I don't really like bringing in the war sort of spirit for hopefully obvious reasons, but when humanity has put its mind to some big effort, it has done amazing things. The Rapid Transition Alliance, based in the UK, made a video with the BBC about how we laid entire railways in a weekend, built many aeroplanes, or what, you know, I'm sure recently they've turned around many ventilators, for example. So there is so much that we could do if we've truly focused. And I think the most hopeful thing within that, from my point of view, is knowing that nature will heal herself if we would only get out of the way. And you look around at all the patches of land that are just here and there and think, what if we just let nature have that back? You don't have to do anything. In some places with rewilding it, you know, there might be interventions that are also helpful. We can turn our farming into ecological farming, agroecology, and the biggest opportunity for carbon capture and storage is in our soil, both of carbon atoms and in the creatures of the soil, and a healthy pasture. And that can be done quickly, you know, we have to heal our soils anyway, because by the way, they're fucked as well, like the oceans and the rivers. So why don't, you know, the solution for for one of the crises is the solution for them all. It's about localizing the economy, then it's about having healthier food, it's about good work for everybody. It all comes together. So, you know, we have to take on the political economy. And I guess you asked me where to have spirit from. I think partly from that thing I said earlier, in that I think there's a piece of hubris if you think you know what's happening or what's supposed to be done, or how this is going to play out, because one doesn't. There's the great mystery, and who knows what's at play here, and whether consciousness shifts through a big wound and a big heat. Who knows? I just feel like I'm on this earth at this time. I'm it's not, I'm not the great designer or whatever we want to say. But then also this political economy and this which is the kind of most like unpleasant manifestation of the patriarchy. It's got to the, I mean, we're talking today on election day, right, in the US, of the most toxic, narcissistic show of like, just that's what it looks like. That's how bad it gets, the misogyny and anti-Semitism and racism that's showing itself, that's been hidden. It's not like new stuff. That's what was there, folks, but it's showing. Do you see what I mean? It's like it's all coming to the surface, and I just think there's such opportunity for change. And I asked you before we started speaking about what you meant by sacred activism, because for me, being rebellious is, I mean, slightly childish word in some ways, but it can be an initiatory act, because we are in this system, we're creating it with our consciousness. And when you do something rebellious, there's a place where you're telling yourself in your spirit, this is not mine. I'm not standing in this anymore. And whether that's standing in the street, refusing to move, or what I'm working on right now is something called money rebellion, which is a refusal to pay certain taxes or debts. We just so have the power, folks, to stop this madness. We have to kind of step up. And I think it requires us to be courageous, and it requires us to come together. And why wouldn't we want to do that?
It's interesting that you call being rebellious as being an initiation into something, because there are ways of being rebellious. I mean, in some way, to be rebellious is a way to liberate yourself from certain identities that you are basically used to live in. In that sense, it is an initiation. But there is also a form of rebellious where it's easy to point the finger, let's put it that way. But I think the initiation that you're talking about goes beyond just seeing this and this and this has to change. It's an initiation in the way we perceive life. What is the initiation that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I thank you for saying about that finger pointing thing, because one of our principles and values in Extinction Rebellion is no blaming and shaming. I obviously referred to Trump earlier, and there's certain behaviours that we're not going to hesitate to point out. People are a product of the operating system of the consciousness that we're running at the minute. And my understanding of initiation is that it's something that you decide you're going to do, and it's scary. Some part of it you're resistant to, and you have a deep sense that it's the right thing to do. And so you walk forwards and step into this thing, and out the other side you're a different person, having done that. You've grown up. I think in the indigenous cultures we're not grown up till 52, so we've got I've still got a few years to go. But I think, and also we're often called, I think, little brother, little sister in the West, and I think this is part of it. We have to grow up, and we're a culture that lacks initiation, and I think this is one way of self-initiating. I mean, there's other things that people need to do as well, but
let me ask it the other way around also, because there's something very powerful about being rebellious, but there's something also quite dangerous about being rebellious. And let's put it that way, a populist rebellion is also a form of rebellion. And I'm sure if we talk about Trump, for example, there are a lot of people, and I don't want to blame them either, who vote for him out of rebelliousness against the establishment. And to some degree, I understand that, because there is also truth to that. Maybe I would not agree with the conclusions, but it seems that you're talking to a different point or to a deeper point. What's the difference between kind of a populist understanding and a populist blaming against the establishment, and what you think we have to wake up to?
And I mean, of course, you know, and we've had the same thing in the UK with Brexit. It's a capture of a redirection of energy, because it's so establishment. There's just a fight in the establishment, in particular between those that are focused more on finance and those focused more on property. That's my understanding of it. It's just an argument on the right. There's nothing rebellious about it at all. You've just been pulled from one team to the other, right? You know, there are lots of emotions and senses of things not being right. People have a sense that they're being manipulated, and before you know it, they can be brought into thinking that there's some big conspiracy going off. I mean, like, basically there is, in the sense that there's a lot of people conspiring, but you don't have to believe in some kind of wacky conspiracy theory. You just need to look at some decent journalism about what's happening in secrecy jurisdictions or whatever. Or, you know, people have a sense that they're being mistreated, or that some people are getting more than they should be, but all these things get grabbed and scapegoating. You know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's just a capture and distortion. And I think that I don't particularly want to get massively into the polarity of the left and right, because obviously it's more three-dimensional than that. But in that way, the right seem to be quite clever at organizing people and using the sort of, you know, weaponization of big data tools and all the rest of it to do mass manipulation. And I think there's a question of, or at least on what I might call the progressive left, of strategy and how we work together across our differences to actually create effective social movements. So I think that here's where I think there's a difference. You know, how much are you able to get people on the streets and sustain that? You know, you can wind people up and fire them up, but can you get them organized in a social movement? I kind of doubt that. I don't know. I'm asking that question as I'm sitting here. I'm thinking, well, you know, the Tea Party and others have done a pretty decent job, probably. So maybe they can. But I tend to. I guess I think that there's, you know, when you're carried by love, that it has more endurance. It's harder to get to. It's harder to stay with, because there's so much comes up and is in the way of it, isn't it? The sort of like immediate emotions of hatred, of anger, of fear, they're easier to stimulate. To tap into love and to really hold that within a movement I think is what we've been asked to do.
You asked me in the pre-conversation, and you brought it up in the conversation itself, why we with Evolve also use the word sacred activism. And isn't that what you were just touching on by the love that needs to be brought center stage? Also related to the recognition that there's something sacred about life itself, about our relationships, and that when we talk about the progressive left, the word sacred is something that's definitely a difficult word. And just to be able to liberate the word sacred and to take away kind of old churchy understanding of what it means, but to understand that every one of us has an understanding. If somebody says nothing is sacred to me, that it gives you shivers, and you don't have to have a certain metaphysical understanding of sacred. There's something in our relationship to life where if we just acknowledge that there's something sacred in the core of it, the relationship to life itself, the relationship to each other, and also the relationship to people we disagree with changes. and that a form of activism that puts this also center stage, that we, even how we organize society, how we organize economy, sacredness since the medieval time has no place in that. It's efficiency, it's not sacredness. That there is something in the way we organize, we see, and we relate to life that goes terribly wrong by our completely missing the point that there's something sacred underneath all of it.
I think it's Wendell Berry said something like, there's no unsacred places, just sacred places and desecrated places. And I think it's easier to think of sacredness when you think of land, you know, really beautiful land. And I mean, I agree. I think that what we're wanting, what means so much to us is beauty and quality, and that things can be still useful within that. But when things are just a machine to create money, it lacks so much beauty. It's painful to be around. But I guess I was asking you that because I've heard that phrase, sacred activism, and I've sometimes been a bit suspicious of it. I've wondered, I think, because I think I've heard different definitions, and when it's sort of meaning activism that understands that there's, I mean, so activism as in political activism that understands that there's something sacred here that's wanting to be seen or birthed. But I think I've sometimes understood it, at least from some quarters, to mean that the act of working on yourself, let's say inner work, is activism. It's sacred activism, and to an extent, I agree with that. In that we taught another principle and value of Extinction Rebellion is our regenerative culture. We say we want to have a regenerative culture. We're working towards it, and part of that is inner work, understanding that, you know, we're all going to bring our strengths and our weaknesses and our baggage and all that to the work we do. And a wonderful woman, Mickey Kashtan, that I work with, talked about purpose-led healing, and I think the reason why someone, let's say the progressive left, look at some people that might think of themselves as spiritual activists with some suspicion is that it can look indulgent. It can look like, are these folks ever going to get off the yoga and meditation mats and actually get on the streets, you know, where we're also needed. You know, like, don't we need to sort of get some of the people on the streets on the yoga mats and vice versa? So I think that, first of all, any healing work that we're thinking of, it's like, what purpose is it serving? Because we've all got probably an infinite amount of healing work to do. And if you make that your life's work, I mean, again, it's a choice. But if it's, to me, it has more meaning when it's got a purpose. So I look to what's getting in the way of me showing up well in XR and take that to my therapeutic spaces, to my ceremony. Yeah. And I mean, and it also brings up this kind of wider conversation, I think, about the different aspects on the left that I was thinking about in advance of this conversation. I could say more about, but
please.
Yeah. So, you know, George Lakoff wrote this wonderful and very easy to read book, actually, called Don't Think of an Elephant, that was about framing how you talk about things and how it will be understood and by whom. And within that, he talked about the different people on the so-called progressive left and their different focuses. So some are more anti-authority, some people more focused about the class system, some more about the environment and human rights and so on. And if you make your messaging very specific to one of those types, the others might miss it. And to use framing that is going to, more people can understand it. And I've been thinking about that, and also thinking, you know, about Ken Wilber's work, where he's talking about the narcissism that holds back the green progressive left from moving into sort of the teal layer. If people know, I'm guessing, no spiral dynamics here. and how that shows up. And I think I've just been sort of thinking about George's categories and thinking with those of us that focus, what I see in activism and the environmental movement are roughly 3 different groups. There's the more spiritual stroke cosmic left, as they're sometimes called, right? Or sacred, whatever you want to say, the more sort of radical left, which would have people with anti-authoritarian leanings more into the sort of identity politics, I don't particularly like that phrase, but anyway, anti-capitalist type orientation. And then there's another category, I think, and I'm not saying any, it's generalization is always a problem, isn't it? And I feel like I've got a foot in, not that I've got 3 feet in each of these camps, right? I identify with each of them in different ways. And then there's one that's more about human rights. It's more leaning towards mainstream politics and the science. And they all bring something of value and they all bring something problematic, in my opinion. And I think it would be really good for people to think about where they're more sitting and see what the strengths are and maybe what the shadows are within those. So that's the reason I asked you about the sacred activists. I see it as being really wanting to be led by the heart, by love, having a deep understanding of trauma and the need for inner work. I don't always see a strong enough political theory, a strong enough sense of how racism shows up, what white privilege looks like, and sometimes that sort of moving into narcissism and indulgence, and lack of clear purpose. So I'm talking about myself, right? I'm not telling you about anybody else. If anybody recognises this, fine. The radical left, let's say, I think in general has such a fantastic analysis of what's going off and in the political economy, and are much more willing to stretch to meet and work with people from a different community. So the sort of intersectional working. But I think the lack of sacred, at times the anti-leadership type of vibe, and sometimes quite a strong sense of superiority and self-righteousness is just like, ugh, it's like, I don't want to go anywhere near that. And then with the sort of more mainstream human rights piece, it can be much more focus on strategy, on leadership, people who put in vast hours, have a good link to the mainstream, can sort of understand how to just talk to ordinary people sort of thing. I think sometimes it can be very simplistic, again, like the sacred, and not have the sort of anti-racism understanding and so on. So, I think there's a piece of work needs to happen where people understand where they're more sitting and try and look outside of their bubble to other bits of the progressive left. And we could have a really honest and beautiful dialogue about what we bring, both good and bad, and try and kind of have a bit of humility and togetherness around it. I don't know if that didn't make any sense.
No, very, very much so. From your perspective, what would bring these different groups together? What would allow them, what would motivate them or us to engage in a dialogue that is more than a debate?
Thank you. I really love that dialogue more than a debate, because it's debating is so tedious at times, isn't it? It's just like, how can I win? Yeah, I think first of all to recognise where we're sitting mostly and what judgments we're making about other people. I might have just said a whole pile of judgy things. I hope not. I think it's what I see anyway. But what assumptions we're making, and ask of those other folks what they see in us, what assumptions, judgments they may be making. So going into a space with humility and a willingness to learn from each other. I think there's a healing needed.
Do you also because we come to the end of our time here, do you see this happening? Is there something happening where you feel there's the beginning of something that really can be powerful? And if yes, what is it and where do you see it?
I have a wonderful colleague called Skeena Rathor, who's leading co-liberation work for Extinction Rebellion, which is based on some of this understanding, I guess, that that we need to heal and come together. And I would say there's quite a bit of resistance around, and it's taken some time to define and get a program together. One of the this is what once you're really clear about, for example, how racism or the oppression of disabled people or whatever shows up in a social movement, then sometimes there's this expectation that, okay, I've said my piece now, it may be healed. Well, I wish, but 5,000 years of patriarchy, it's not going to go away on one training session or one light bulb moment. So what we have to do is systematize the responses. So if a, let's say, a disabled person says, yet again, I came to this action and it wasn't working for me because of X, Y, and Z reasons, then what systemic changes do we need to make in how we organize? And I see that work happening in XR. I wouldn't say it's strong enough or good enough, but I do see it happening. And I think another thing that excites me is that we do try and organize in a decentralized way. So we're a bit of humanity trying to work out a new way of constellating together, a new way of operating together. I asked Frederic Laloux for any advice and people who might help, and he said, Gail, I think, Frederic Laloux from Reinventing Organizations. I know you know Thomas, but just to say for the audience in case. And he said, I think you guys are at the cutting edge in terms of trying to do teal organizing, and we have a piece of work happening in the UK in Extinction Rebellion that's called the Systems Realignment Work, that's had some funding, where we're trying to look at how do you set up systems of feedback and learning, for example, systems of resource sharing, systems of decision making, and so on. I don't know that these things are going to go well, but I know that we're trying. What else can the divine ask of us but to try, and to enjoy it while we're doing it.
In the very end of this conversation, I just want to ask you directly, what do you want to be called to? What do you want to call us to, the audience of Radio Evolve? What should we pay attention to? Where should we go with this?
On a really practical level, I want some people to decide not to pay their mortgages, to take out credit cards with banks, and then to give the money away to Indigenous support through Survival International. So there's some cheeky stuff. Look up Money Rebellion and see what we're planning. This is based in the UK at the minute, so if you want to organise it in your country, get in touch. And on a deeper level, I think it's a time in the grief, in the remorse, to really reach for each other and find our imagination for the new things that are coming. Find our longing for it and make it happen. We're amazing. What an amazing species we are. Let's make it happen and find your part in it. And never use the word just about you. I'm just doing this, I'm just doing that. Make your thing that you're doing as just because it's as beautiful and as qualityful as possible, just because it's enjoyable to do that.
Gail, thank you very much for this conversation.